Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's lecture on spirituality and wellness. This week, we will take a closer look at what spirituality consists of, how it differs from religion, and how it impacts our well being. As you might expect, this is a thought provoking talk, and the lecture is going to try and help you reflect on who you are as a person and to think of ways to be more intentional about becoming your ideal self. So be ready to participate and think through some of these prompts. As usual, we'll build on the textbook's material, so study both the lecture and the book in order to be most successful on your quiz. Let's start with an exercise that helps you consider your life up until this point. Forgive me for being a little morbid, but perhaps it's best to start at the end and think of what you'd like to have accomplished during your life. So, for instance, pretend that you're at your own funeral. I know it sounds dark, but follow me here. You see a few people talking about you and your life. What are they saying? Write down a couple thoughts about what you hear other different people talking about. Now let's think about what you want people to say about you. List two or three things that you want to be remembered for, or things that you hope people will say. Are there any differences between what people would say about the way you live your life and what it looks like today? We're talking about essentially the current self, who you are today, versus your ideal self, who you'd like to be. So, after you've taken a few moments to jot down some ideas, feel free to pause the lecture and continue when you're ready. All right, let's try one more of these. Pretend that you were selected for an award, and a journalist came from the newspaper to interview you about the accomplishment. What award would you have won? And what does that award actually mean? Using a short sentence, what would the headline of that newspaper article be? What would you want that journalist to write about? Take a moment to come up with a couple of different ideas and jot those down. Again, we're talking about who we are today, or our current self, versus who we want to become, which is our ideal self. What would you like to accomplish? What are some of the personal traits or strengths that you have that would help you accomplish this? Perhaps most importantly, what types of decisions would you have to make today in order to move in that direction? When we take time to learn about our inner self, we can make choices to move in a direction that we're most excited for, or maybe the ones that we'd be most proud of. And those are the ones that mean the most to us. It's a sense of meaning that I hope we're able to talk more about today. Hopefully, the lecture will help you get in touch with your inner self so you can be more intentional about which direction you're moving in. So, today we're going to talk about the concepts that are foundational with these questions. First, we want to talk about what spirituality is and understand more of the meaning behind the word. We'll move on to look at the meaning and purpose and how these things are also universal within every individual. After this, we're going to bust the assumption that spirituality and religion are the same thing. Many of us think that in order to be spiritual, we have to be affiliated with some sort of religion, and vice versa. If we are a member of a religion, we're inherently spiritual, which certainly isn't so, but we aren't sure how to look at spirituality without thinking of religion, so we need to talk about that some more. From there, we will talk about whether our pursuit of spirituality is done in the name of intrinsic means or if we're driven more by those means that lie outside of ourselves, or extrinsic means. It seems like a very simple list of objectives, however, we want to take our time and go into depth and really try to reflect on these. If you join me in this, by the end of the lecture, you may have a much better idea of who you are as a person and have a clearer view of what you would like the remainder of your life to look like. It sounds pretty deep, right? Well, we'll do our best to keep it light and easy while we get into some of the main points. So let's get started. So, in order to dive into this concept of spirituality, we can take a classic who, what, where approach to exploring ourselves and then start asking ourselves the whys and etc. To answer the who questions, can you think of certain individuals to whom you feel most connected to? If you can, list 2 or 3 reasons why you're connected to these people. If you had to explain your connection to someone else, what would you say? Perhaps thinking of activities or exercises is more useful. What activities do you truly enjoy doing? What would you say is the reason you enjoy them? Again, if you had to explain it to somebody, how would you put it? Maybe thinking of places is a helpful exercise for you. Lastly, are there certain places you enjoy? What seem to have a special meaning for you? This could apply to certain times of your life. Can you think of a period of time where you're at peace, maybe you are comfortable, proud, or happy? You might not be able to answer these questions right away, but I promise if you spend time thinking and reflecting on these questions, you will come up with some very meaningful answers, and some of those answers just might surprise you. Feel free to pause the lecture here before moving on to the next slides. So let's take a closer look at spirituality. Everyone, regardless of what they believe, experiences these feelings of spirituality. It's an idea that's different for everyone. For instance, if we made a list of all the different responses to the questions we started this lecture with, it's almost certain that everybody would have different answers. The piece that links them is that everyone has to stop and take some time to consider them, and perhaps even to seek more outside help, and maybe help from individuals that'll push you to find more meaning, etc. The common theme for individuals is the idea of experiencing transcendence, or experiencing something larger than oneself. When we think of something larger than ourselves, it really is easy to start thinking of a higher power or religious idols. But that's not always going to be the case. Many times these are feelings that we can't really explain, but they're very real. Some individuals might organize themselves as members of a religion that share a belief in the same higher power, but even then, all the members of a religion may have their own unique spiritual experiences or meanings within that faith. What is really important to understand is that spirituality is developmental, meaning that you experience a spiritual sense one way when you're younger, but that spiritual experience can be much different as you grow and develop throughout your lifetime. However individuals experience their spiritual side, we know through research that spirituality plays a large role in maintaining a well lifestyle. You can imagine that if a person did not have a strong sense of who they were, that any attempts to improve their lifestyle might somewhat miss the mark. Having a strong sense of our personal identity gives us the confidence and self-esteem that we need, and it means that we're more likely to make decisions that directly relate to who we are and our authentic self. But having that sense of spirituality lets us go through life anchored to who we are. So when the seas get rough, we aren't necessarily thrown about, but we're more able to stay stable and tied to our authentic self. It helps us make sense of our lives. That stability also helps us cope with stormy times where stress is something that we can't seem to get away from. All of this helps us deal with our overall stress and anxiety levels, which reduces a lot of the mental strain, kind of like when we talked about exercise with anxiety or depression that we might experience from day to day. Now, this is especially true for you as a college student. Many traditional college students or young adults are experiencing their first taste of freedom and autonomy. Without having others like parents around to guide you and give you advice, you're left to figure it all out on your own. Now's the time where you can really stop and look at who you are and what you want to do or who you want to be. The process of self-discovery or figuring out who you really are is often cited as one of the main takeaways of the college experience. In order to start with a sense of spirituality, we essentially need to look at our feelings of meaning and purpose. These refer to essentially why we exist. Now, it doesn't have to be a lofty, overarching feeling of why humanity exists, but it can refer to your life and your story. So think back to the first questions we started with. What were your answers to those? What do those tell you about who you are and what your purpose is? If we think about what we hope people will be able to say about our lives, we can start living in ways that reflect that meaning. Now, having a firm understanding of who you are at your core can help you weather some of those stormy seas that I referred to earlier. Often we aren't sure how to handle certain situations, but we think of the overarching purpose that we have chosen for our lives, and that can make the difficult times, especially difficult decisions, much easier to cope with. One of the biggest pieces of finding your meaning and purpose is having an unconditional self or sense of self-acceptance. Being able to accept who you are, what you do, and why you do it gives you a peace of mind that allows you to build or make additional changes. Sometimes we're quick to correct ourselves or say punishing type thoughts to ourselves, and we end up being very harsh, especially with ourselves. We say we're our own uh, worst self critics or we're hardest on ourselves and all these different things. Rarely do we take the time to balance that criticism with praise and self acceptance. The meaning and purpose movement was really made famous by Viktor Frankl when he wrote A Man's Search for Meaning. His book is about his experiences in a Nazi prison camp. And it was during his time that he studied the reactions of guards and inmates and found that the victims of these conditions who were able to find meaning in their experience or maintain a sense of personal meaning and purpose, something that the Nazis worked very hard to try and remove, by the way, were the ones who were able to be more resilient in the face of such severe tragedy. It's an extraordinary book that gives you better insight into how important these concepts are to human functioning. Now, there's a very nice model of meaning and purpose in the textbook. The image here is another more complicated model I found using a quick internet search, and it may help add some detail to how we view ourselves and our purpose. The main two pieces to highlight here are the differences between an outcome and a process. First, let's talk about outcomes. After exploring and pursuing your spirituality, you may come to a sense of very meaningful conclusions. You may learn something about yourself, you may discover a type of spiritual practice that's meaningful for you, etc. All of these are concrete outcomes. Opposed to models that focus on outcomes, there are certain models that focus on the process. For instance, whatever practice you need to do to achieve an outcome, like meditation or yoga, would be that process, the active process of engaging in an activity. So instead of doing an activity because of what the outcome will be or what you'll receive from it, you simply do it because that process is what gives you something, not an outcome, the process. So let's try and think of another example. You might be really motivated to volunteer and help build a school in an underprivileged area. You go through the whole process of volunteering, helping others, building a school, etc. Eventually, the school was built and everyone was happy. If you volunteered because you're interested in the final result, as in that school, then you might be more outcome oriented. But if you volunteered because you believe in volunteering and you weren't as concerned about the end result, then you might be more process oriented. Both, either a process or the outcome, can give you a sense of meaning and purpose. Oftentimes, we aren't only driven by one or the other, but a combination of both. So think about some of the things that you do daily and whether or not they are outcome or process oriented, or how they might be a combination of both. So now when we think of what spirituality consists of, we can argue that it's present in nearly any example that you might have thought of on the previous slide. Little bits of meaning and purpose go into our behaviors whether we realize them or not. And here's a nice diagram that lists many of the different areas spirituality can impact and all the different forms it can take. So by taking a look at each of these, hopefully it starts to sink in that spirituality can exist anywhere. It's simply up to us to identify it and recognize it. Our meaning and purpose is something we carry with us throughout each day and influences everything we do. So what makes this unique is that we might feel greater senses of spirituality in different areas. It all traces back to the concept of transcendence, where we feel as if we're a part of something much larger than ourselves. So think more about where you might have some of these feelings. These can range from small feelings of purpose throughout the day, or certain places or locations that give you an overwhelming sense of transcendence. So then, how do we keep this concept separate from religion? It's almost an automatic thought that once we start discussing spirituality, we slide right into a talk about religion. There are definitely separate constructs, but we don't spend time talking about the differences. Well, let's do that now. Let's take a look at this table, and that table will help us outline some of the distinctions between spirituality and religion. First, religion is a specific form of spirituality. It has scriptures, important writings, beliefs, rituals, all of these things, where spirituality is more universal and much less scripted. Anyone can have feelings of transcendence regardless of their religious beliefs. Next, religion is largely external. Religious practices take place in a certain building among a community of others surrounded by certain symbols. There is also forms of extrinsic responses to your participation. You might be praised by others when you do attend services, or maybe you'll be in some sort of trouble or feel some sort of judgment if you don't attend. Spirituality, on the other hand, is much more internal. When you experience these feelings of transcendence, you may be by yourself, not surrounded by anything particular, and no one will recognize whether or not you've had a spiritual moment. Now, the third line of our table talks about how these two are experienced. Usually, the external nature of religion and the scriptures or stories leads us to be more of a cognitive experience. Prayers or hymns are verbalized and thought out, where spirituality is much more of a feeling. When we talk about transcendence, there are no scripts or words necessary. In fact, many argue that it's often difficult or impossible to explain how it feels. And so we label spirituality as much more of an affective or feelings-based event. Next, these rituals that exist among religions can distinguish themselves from spirituality. Religion may move you through a series of steps, as in a structured prayer or service, that follows somewhat of a predictable timeline in order to evoke these spiritual feelings. Opposed to this, spirituality might strike you at any time, regardless of where you are or what you're doing. And then lastly, the external and structured nature of religion makes these experiences much more public, where spirituality occurs internally, making it much more of a private experience that others aren't aware of and they might not even understand. So looking at the differences, it's easy to see that both may be present for an individual. Certainly, religion is at least partially intended to improve the spiritual self. However, we can also imagine scenarios where these occur separately. Religious individuals may or may not necessarily experience transcendence that they're describing in spirituality. So religious individuals may or may not be spiritual, and vice versa. Here are some 2007 estimates of the religious breakdown in both the US as well as around the world. First, on the left, you can see that a large majority of Americans are either Protestant or Roman Catholic. The two groups make up about 75% of all citizens. Feel free to compare this chart with that on the right, and then keeping in mind the different separation of the sects of Christianity, and if grouped together would represent a much larger portion on the chart than they do separately. Feel free to pause the lecture here if you like, otherwise let's keep moving. Now, we mentioned earlier that spirituality and religion aren't the same. This means that individuals may attend religious services regularly, but never experience a sense of spirituality. The textbook offers different terms or phrases for these different combinations of religious and spiritual experiences. Individuals who have a religious practice but do not experience a sense of spirituality can be considered to be on the Jungian path of pretending. This might apply to those who simply attend services because they're supposed to, or those who attend seeking this transcendence, but something might be getting in the way. A good example might be picturing children who are taken to services by their parents, although they don't get it or are uninterested in what's going on. The second category is a match between spirituality and religion. Not only does the individual attend religious services, but they also experience a sense of spiritual transcendence. This, in most cases, would match the intent of religion. We would call this a hand-in-hand experience. This is what many individuals assume a religious practice will be when individuals participate. And the third category is a rapidly growing group that experiences spirituality, but does so without practicing any specific form of religion. I would argue that this growth is partially due to the fact that we're spending more time understanding the differences between religion and spirituality. Before, many believed that individuals had to be some member of some religion in order to experience a sense of spirituality or transcendence. Understanding that these feelings can occur in any and all places means individuals don't necessarily need to have a religious affiliation to develop a sense of meaning or purpose. So think about where you fit. Being aware of what your current situation is and think about how it compares to your ideal self that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. Would you like to be more spiritual? Are you religious and seeking some sort of spiritual experience to go with it? If we are aware and can identify a need, then we can be intentional about taking steps and making it a reality. Let's expand on one of the differences between spirituality and religion. Let's focus on the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic spirituality. These are very important differences. Usually, this means joining a group, typically a religion, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. For instance, those interested in volunteering that we mentioned earlier might form or join a group of individuals who also enjoy the experience. Others might take a hiking and really enjoy hiking, so they join a hiking group where everyone has a transcendent experience in nature without joining a religion. Regardless of what your group looks like, individuals who practice spirituality extrinsically need to be cautious of something called a spiritual bypass. It is a spiritual form of groupthink where the individual experience is no longer felt and the feelings are channeled through the group. For instance, if you return from a spiritual experience, could you explain when, how, or what you actually experienced your individual spiritual moment? We mentioned before about how transcendence is hard to describe, but could you confirm that you had an individual moment? Or perhaps are all your memories or moments tied to that of the larger group and not to the individual? This can lead to individuals to believe that they're having some sort of sense of spirituality and meaning and purpose. However, they might not have it as an individual. They might only have it through the group, and that's a dangerous thought. We don't want somebody to lose their identity amongst the group. So this more closely would match Jung's path of pretending that we mentioned earlier, instead of reflecting a hand-in-hand experience where the individual gains some sort of sense of spiritual benefit. So this is in contrast now to experiencing your spirituality internally. Intrinsic spirituality is what builds our identity and a sense of meaning or purpose. Pursuing spiritual or religious practices for the intrinsic reasons is what leads to growth, where that extrinsic or external focus is going to undermine your sense of meaning and purpose and lead to a lack of transcendence. So whether you practice it with a group or on your own, be sure to focus on those intrinsic sources of meaning and purpose in order to receive the maximum wellness benefits from your practice. One of the last things I like to talk about is the difference between meditation and prayer. Much like the differences between spirituality and religion, these are similar constructs that often are just combined into the same idea. Keep in mind that both of these practices are activities that can both be a part of a larger religious experience or just done by oneself individually. Let's take a look at each of these from the perspective of someone doing them just at home by themselves, and we'll try to remove some of the religious emphasis off of these. First is meditation. Meditation is essentially a practice of seeking greater self-awareness. We mentioned mindfulness before, and the book actually talks about multiple different forms of this exercise, but the result is usually some sort of direct physiological experience or benefit. For instance, sitting peacefully and regulating your breathing has the ability to directly slow down your heart rate, release muscle tension, and lower blood pressure. This is why meditation is an excellent practice for people seeking emotional stability. Not only does your body start to come back to a baseline, your ability to think clearly and concentrate would also improve from ongoing practice. So this direct connection takes practice and relates it directly into benefits. Now there are also many different forms of prayer. A couple are listed here, some more are in your book, and this usually expands on what we're talking about here. Usually prayers are going to be made for some sort of external purpose. Now, for instance, an individual might be praying for a personal request or for a request on behalf of someone else. There's also a type of prayer that expresses thanks and gratitude. That's going to kind of counter that external source of prayer. Prayers of gratitude have the ability to change someone's cognitive thinking by replacing negative or spiteful thoughts with those of thanks. We've talked about this a few times with emotional regulation, or maybe writing and creativity and cognitive well being. Now, also by prayer, individuals are going to find kind of a sense of relief. They'll be able to express their concerns, and they'll feel a sense that everything is going to work out as it should. The prayer leads to that thankfulness or relief, and those then can give the person some kind of physical relief, kind of like what you get through meditation. You actually feel the release of tension as you feel relieved. Namely, individuals feel relief that gives them a break from the stress or rumination, giving them a greater sense of overall well being. And there you have it. Understanding that at this point in your life, these ideas are incredibly important. Most of you are living on your own for the first time and have far less structure than you did previously. All that freedom and autonomy is great, but can kind of lead towards a sense of kind of shock for who you are as a person. Many college students experience a sense of spiritual crisis where they're not really sure of who they are or who they want to become. And you also don't have people like parents around that might have been spiritual or religious role models or guides for you in the past. So consider taking some time to think about who you are, and keep in mind that the first thing you need to do is find a sense of self-acceptance and understanding who you are. And when you're able to be comfortable in your own skin and aware of who you are as a person, you can make meaningful change. Perhaps try to do something today or maybe this week that might improve your spiritual well-being. Whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, consider what you find personally meaningful and be mindful of when you have those feelings of transcendence or being a part of something bigger than yourself. Now, as always, feel free to post us any questions if you'd like. Otherwise, best of luck to you on your quiz, and I hope that you are well this week.